Right. I think that's when my kids liked it so much. They're like, this was fun. Good. I'm glad. I'm glad. Yeah.
My last science class, I was such
What did I? Okay, where are we all?
I'm in I do, yeah. It's accelerated course, so his nails are the best way to buy.
All right, good morning. Good morning. How was everyone? I think I'm tired. Me too. I want another weekend, but it's coming. But we'll get there. We get a Monday off though, which is kind of nice. We get a long weekend, and it's supposed to rain a lot. Is it Thursday? We were supposed to start up soccer on Wednesday, and it's going to rain. I'm like, oh, what a shame. We have to wait one more week. How's that right now? Everyone have a good Super Bowl? Yeah. Are you happy? Anyone happy? I was glad the Eagles won. I was saying to my class before, I'm a big Mahomes fan.
Oh,
but I didn't want him to win. I wanted somebody else to win, so I was really glad the Eagles won. The only reason I like Mahomes, it's so random. So my daughter Paisley, the first one that came to me, not Emma, who had a comment for everything, right? Like, I felt so bad. I told her after school, after the class, I was like, I'm sorry I didn't call on you more, but I had to spread it around. She had her little hand up the whole time, right? But anyway, I like Mahomes because when my daughter was younger, right, she put ketchup on everything. Like she loved ketchup, like on her ketchup. Like it was stupid how much ketchup she ate. And Mahomes puts ketchup on everything. Right, like he loves ketchup. And so we called him Ketchup Mahomes in our house. And like I bought her this little stuffed animal and it's like Mahomes holding a bottle of ketchup. And so like we've loved him in our house for years because of ketchup. Like not even his football accolades, that he liked ketchup. So I was okay with him losing it. I just wish it had been a better game. Like it was kind of sad to watch. We had a little stuffed animal out, and every time he threw an interception, we're like, oh, he fell to the floor, right? Like, but I had a cake, so I could have cared less. Like, I went and bought a cake with like extra flowers, extra frosting flowers for both teams because I didn't want to leave anyone out. So lots of frosting. I could have cared less too much about because I don't like cake. Would you like the half one?
Honestly, I thought it was gonna be better.
You what?
I said I thought it was gonna be better.
Yeah, you thought it'd be better.
They're Brianna's last year.
I mean,
Yeah. Low bar. Okay. Okay. Yes, you only had a bunch of things.
Kendrick was there too.
Yeah. That's true.
I think Kendrick went video.
He's been there twice.
He's the only rap artist that headline.
Yeah, that's
So-
true. That's pretty cool. Right? It was definitely political, right?
I think it should be,
like,
I feel like the rappers, like, they should be more focused on rapping rather than like lip syncing. So I think it's actually good that he
Was actually, yeah.
instead of like all the,
Yeah,
but I get that.
the commercials are always entertaining, right? I can't believe that it's $8 million for 30-second commercials.
Yeah, what was that? What's
8
what's
million.
Kanye? Like, it's.
Nobody's got the paper on that. All right, so I know I started Super Bowl.
No,
talk.
thank you.
I'm gonna
Sorry for letting you
no,
know.
no, no, for like, I'm gonna be sad.
Now.
I played it, but I don't, I don't like watching it.
Oh, you don't like, you
Watching.
don't like what?
Watching, I just love watching.
Who's your team?
Living in a little team, I with a book.
I like individual players for the fantasy.
Oh,
I was a big like Brady fan and then, so that he called the whole game made me happy.
hey, so like, you just support Rangers, like, we support the team as well.
Players.
But like, wait, how do you feel about the whole like bandwagon? Like, do you like the bandwagon?
So let's get back into this. I know I started a side thing, but thank you for tolerating my two children coming in. I have to tell you, I was telling my class before, they were both so excited. All they had to say, especially this class, not to say anything bad about our previous class, but they were like, I love your class. They both were like, can we go to college now? And I'm like, you're 10, slow down. But eventually, like you get to, but they loved all of you. Like that's all they talked about all week. So they're going to my partner's class this week in high school. We'll see who wins the competition of popularity. Right? I don't know. Like, probably her. It's always her who wins, but that's okay. So we'll jump back into where we were last time. So we're going to finish up the chapter on gender. We have a few more things, and then we'll get into anatomy today, into reproductive anatomy. And if you're looking at the schedule, right, again, we don't have class Monday, but we're getting pretty close to being caught up from some of that disruption in that first week and a half. So we've made up a little bit of time. We're doing pretty well. So we left off here, right? We were talking about like some of the stereotypes of gender. And again, thank you so much for all of the wonderful things that were shared last class. I think it was a really like interesting and dynamic class. So thank you for that. And what we will look at today, just kind of like, how do we learn gender roles just a tiny bit more, because we talked about it a lot. And then some varieties of gender roles to kind of end the chapter. Okay? So, and again, I feel like we kind of got into this, but we learn a lot of gender roles and injunctions and expectations from our parents, from our peers, from society and modeling, everything that's up here, television and the media, religion, teachers, textbooks, right? There's so many messages about gender that we get from all of these different sources. And I guarantee if you think about it, you can probably come up with like an example for each category of some moment where somebody said, you shouldn't do this, or you should do this because of your gender identity, right? This comes up all the time. Oh my gosh, we were watching football yesterday and there was a commercial and my father-in-law looked at Emma and was like, well, you can't be a firefighter because that's for men. And I was like, excuse me? Oh, poor guy, I like ripped into him so bad. Like that's a gender role injunction, right? That would be modeling or things that parents teach you, right? The media does a lot of this, our textbooks, our books, religion, everything kind of telling us what's okay, what's expected, what isn't. Those stereotypes come very much from these different sources. And there's just a lot of them that we're constantly being bombarded with. A lot of really cool documentaries about these two, some of them kind of older, but we see a lot of it, especially in like Disney, not to pick on Disney, I love Disney, but like a lot of like expectations and modeling there, kind of getting better over time, but still a lot of it. And then again, all of the other things that are up here. When we look at some varieties of gender, there's a lot of terms. There are so many terms. And I think I mentioned this last time, that for every term that we have, there's like another one, right? There's so many. But when we talk about varieties of gender identity, we tend to talk about like a gender binary versus a gender spectrum, right? And I think like, even though we tend to approach it as a binary meaning two, male, female, or masculine, feminine, gender does exist much more on a spectrum, which is kind of what we talked about a lot last class. And so we have a couple of terms that can sometimes, you maybe you've heard these before. If somebody is cisgendered, that means their gender identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. Most people identify as cisgender, right? So you were born female and you identify as like feminine, or you're born male and you identify as masculine. But there's a lot of other terms that people can go by, right? And this is by no means like an exhaustive list. An old term, and I mentioned this one last time, androgyny is a very old term. This was popular in the 70s. It was created by a woman named Sandra Bem, who created this sex role inventory to kind of talk about blending male and female attributes for the first time. Now, she said male and female, it should have been masculine and feminine, right? Because she was talking about gender, not sex. And she called it her sex role inventory. It should have been a gender role inventory, but we had to start somewhere. So androgyny comes from the Greek word ander and gyna, meaning man, woman. So kind of a misconception. She's talking about blending sex, even though what she really meant was blending of gender. Some kind of more contemporary, more common terms now, someone can be agendered, where they don't really identify with any gender whatsoever. Pangender, where you kind of combine everything, a little bit of everything across the spectrum would be pan. Gender queer, maybe you don't fit neatly into one. Non-binary, probably the most popular of all of these, where somebody doesn't want to be one or the other. They don't want to pick one. They're all kind of like saying the same thing in slightly different ways, and there are more, but those are some of the really common like terms for people who don't want to pick one or the other. Did you have a?
Yeah, but I was kind of asked if I'm talking based on behavior or based on also physical, but it's not behavior. So
Yes. So the way that it was meant to be was a blending of like masculine and feminine. But again, even in the word choice, it was a little bit off. And I think that was just because it was kind of in its infancy of studying it properly in the 70s. Yeah.
It's really sex isn't even a binary, it's
Right.
like it's bimodal because there are externalities with like being sex and
Yeah. Well, and that's where it gets tricky. Yeah, such a misconception. Same thing when we get to orientation, sexual orientation, that we talk about it as like neat categories. And I think we really got into that a lot last time, that it's not. Right. And so even all these terms here, I mean, they're all kind of referring to like varieties of things that are expressing similar concepts in slightly different ways. Yeah.
I was in a math class, we were talking about like bimodal distribution. I'm like, oh yeah, I mentioned that, and he was like, no, and I'm like, but I can find government documents talking about how it's a thing. He's like, no. I'm like, okay, well.
It's not a binary anymore if there are externalities.
Yeah. And that's where it gets tricky, right? If we talk about it as a binary, but then we have people who are intersexed, what happens with that category? Right. And that's where it's going to get really messy in some of the like legislative stuff. It doesn't really account for that very small but existing population of people who are technically intersexed, which is sex, not gender. Because it has to do with a chromosomal blending or an anatomical blending. What do we do with that category? And I'm not sure that has been addressed yet.
like
Yeah.
the whole Olympic thing that happened.
Sure. Yeah, right. Where, so if somebody is born biologically male and then they transition to being female, technically now that person could not compete in
Right.
like female sports.
But yeah, you know, I'm like, I forgot. The fighter,
It's just like Algeria.
Yeah.
Boxer?
Yeah, the
Oh.
boxer.
MMA fighter that people thought was a man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
It's
so
illegal to be
horrible.
trans in your country, so I don't know why they call it that.
Yeah, so it gets messy with like the competitive stuff. And so now there's different like legislation related to that. But yeah, so all of these are like looking at, like, it's tricky, like it is tricky. How do you identify versus how you were born? And again, we don't always fit neatly, which makes it complicated. So transsexual is the one that's a little different. So transsexual, transgender, let's talk about those terms just a little bit more, right? Somebody who's transgender. Okay, so trans means like against, right? So somebody who isn't the gender that they were born into. I don't know if you can see some of the issues with that, just talking about it, but this is a term used to people whose appearance and behaviors don't conform to traditional gender roles. Now, how do we define traditional gender role is the tricky thing, because this is constantly changing, right? If you go back to like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, women couldn't even wear pants, right? Like you weren't allowed to wear pants. Like that was what was defined then. A little different now. But so this is something that's constantly evolving. But someone who's transgendered is someone who like is born male, but maybe presents as outwardly female. Okay, right? So that would be like a transgender versus transsexual is somebody who changes their sex. So you were born male, you undergo surgery, you take hormones, and you change your sex biologically. And you can't change your chromosomes. Okay, so you can't change whether you're XX or XY or other, but you can change your anatomy, right? You can have the penis like restructured to form like labia and a clitoris, right? You can have it go the other way as well. That would be someone who's transsexual versus transgender has to do with like hair, clothing, pronouns, behaviors versus changing their actual sex. Now, the tricky thing is you can't change your chromosomes. And we can talk more about that in a minute, but you can change your anatomy. Yeah, so cross-dressing typically is something we might call like someone as like a drag queen or a drag king, where it's typically more performance-based. So when somebody is transgender, it's identity, right? Their identity is being masculine, feminine, or any other term that we want to choose, right? Versus somebody who cross-dresses typically does more like their performance or their show, like RuPaul, probably the most famous drag queen, right? Would be somebody who cross-dresses for like a character. So the motivation behind it, is it your identity or is it more like your show and your So when we have all this new legislation now, so I went and found like some of the exact verbiage, because this is really like new, like in the last like 2 weeks. So we talked about this before, right? The sex of somebody is determined at the moment of fertilization. So when egg and sperm meet, sex is determined on a chromosomal level. Are you XX, XY, or other, which would be intersexed? Okay, so that sex, right, then dictates your gonads, which dictates your anatomy, like we talked about last time. So the new bill that our president signed into the government, so this is his wording, right, or the wording of the bill. The new bill states that the government will only recognize two unchangeable sexes, male and female. The order states it is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in the fundamental and incontrovertible reality. The order defines terms like man and woman based on whether a person at conception belongs to the sex that produces large reproductive cells or produce the small reproductive cells, which will result in anatomy. So that's the technical term of like this new bill. It's talking about like no longer recognizing people who are considered trans. So the reason we're talking about that here is because it obviously relates to this quite a bit. So people can change their anatomy, but according to like new bills, we can't change our sex. That it's something that is set at birth and can no longer be changed and no longer recognized through things like surgery, gender affirmation surgeries, are no longer recognized like kind of the other in between. Yeah. It doesn't. So that's the issue that we'll have to see where it happens. Right? So if from the perspective of this legal bill, we're seeing there are men and women, what do we do with the like, it's only 1%, but it's 1%. Right. So there are people who are born XXY, right? Or who are missing a chromosomal link and technically are intersex. It's not transgender. It would be intersex. So that's not something that's necessarily addressed by the bill, but it will be a gray area that will need to be defined. How it will be defined, I don't know. But according to this new legislation that will take place across our country and might end up in state by state, right? We don't recognize transgender identity anymore, and we're saying that you can no longer change your sex, basically eliminating the term transsexual. Yeah.
So people who have already changed like their legal documents to another gender, how do they just say that? Or
Yeah.
do they have to go back?
But
Or
that's-
how do they even know what people have to go
Yeah.
back?
The tricky thing though is that's gender, right? And so it's messy, right? And so the legislation piece, like I just read it like word for word, is very like black and white, but this isn't a black and white thing. So how do we make that work? It's gonna be pretty tricky. There are gonna be people who aren't going to be able to fit within that criteria, right? Yeah. I'm not sure that's been specified, right? But it's saying that we will no longer recognize anything other than male, female, and that your sex is unchangeable. So literally banning things like gender affirmation and surgeries where people would go in and change or try to change attributes of their sex. So that would be something that, or at least the next number of years will not be recognized. Not in my country. Yeah.
I heard a story where a trans girl was trying to get her passport renewed.
Yeah.
And so she had like all the documentation and she tried to get it removed, like in the female marker. And they just took her passport and refused to give her anything.
Yeah.
And then took her social security card too.
Yeah. And it used to be that you could do on your passport, you could choose X instead of male or female, and that has gone away. So just be aware. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it's very current, right? This is something that literally within the last like, couple of weeks is kind of being talked about, taking place. And so what I want you to understand is how there really is a big difference between sex and gender, right? And we're talking now that you can't change your gender or your sex. And so there are gonna be a lot of like gray areas here that are going to need to be discussed. We'll see what happens, I guess, but as of right now, you know, we're saying in our country that we will only recognize two unchangeable sexes of male and female, which could be a little problematic if people are intersexed or people identify as trans or non-binary or whatnot and would like to do something about it, right? It might end up being like a state by state thing, but for now, we're talking about this on a federal level. Other thoughts or comments or anything else there? Right. Yeah, a lot, but I know. It's tricky because, you know, obviously like we're learning about anatomy, we're learning about human sexuality, so we don't want to make it political. But this is something that is very, yeah.
I don't know if it's necessary to like people asking them, but it's like you can't access certain information and also like federal agencies like using pronouns and addresses, certain other like sites and stuff. So it's like a little bit harder to have access to information and also to like express yourself in the workplace. So that which just makes it harder, but I don't think it's like legal action against, it's just
Yeah, and
just discrimination.
It's just
You know what I mean? It's
discrimination.
just discrimination.
But we're also getting rid of all
It's
of
not
the,
necessarily legal, yeah.
getting rid of all the protections to make that discrimination illegal.
Yeah.
And so the repercussion is somebody who identifies as like trans or transsexual or transgender, there's no legal protection against that anymore, which then has its own implications. You want to finish that thought? Yeah.
Like.
Right.
And, sex and sexuality and sexual orientation, which means that like you can be discriminated on hiring, the hiring process,
Right.
which obviously that is a major, that affects people majorly. If you can get fired legally, be fired, or legally just not hired because of those things.
It's messy at the moment, and a lot of defining that still needs to happen in order to logistically make sense. Yeah.
I just think it's silly because nobody cares if you decide to like change your nose or get a boob job because you don't like how your body looks. But when it comes to like what's between your legs or your hair, I just noticed that like it's so stupid. People think that they can dictate other people's bodies, but you know, we started telling people to do stuff with their bodies, and it's like, oh, what are you doing? You can't do that.
Yeah.
Well, even getting a nose job or a boob job as a cis female is still considered gender affirming care. It's like what makes you feel most comfortable with yourself. So it's it just depends on like how you identify as whether it's okay or not.
Yeah.
Well, it's even now you're looking at a lot of the politicians who are supporting these bills are also like getting gender affirming care, like Matt Gaetz has like plastic surgery and Botox and earplugs. Yeah, it's like we're getting gender affirming care and like all the, who was it? I think there was like a bunch of memes going around. I think it was Ted Cruz or somebody who wears like the lifted shoes and stuff. Like all of these things are like gender affirming care, but you don't want other people to have access to it. It's just for.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask if someone would have a legal expense.
Probably. I mean, there are going to be legal measures, right? There's no doubt that at some point there will be all sorts of legal cases because there's a lot of people who, again, even if we just stay with intersex, if we stay with what is biologically incontrovertibly defined, people can be intersex, right? Which is mean they were born at the moment of conception, they were born not fitting neatly into male or female categories. So that doesn't even account for choice. That was at the moment of biological conception. So there are going to be movements. So it's just a matter of when, right? Yeah.
There already are some legal.
Yes.
Things like, in Trump's first presidency, he banned transgender people from the military.
Right.
And he's doing that again. So there are a lot of service members that are currently suing, being barred from service now.
Yeah, and the only thing that I will say, and just and this, you can take it however you want to take it, right? I'm trying very hard to stay neutral. So
Right.
thank you, because I mean, you can, like, by looking at me, I'm sure you know that I have an opinion, but like, I'm going to, but it's important, like, to present this in a very, like, I'm trying to. So, one thing that I will say, and this is something that we talked about when we talked about history, we tend to go one way, and then we go the other, and we usually find them in the middle, right? So right now, we're way over here, right? And it could be that in the next term, we're still over here. Or it could be that we get back over here, right? Like, we always, throughout history, we go back and forth and back and forth. And almost nothing ends up being set in stone. So just something to keep in mind. This is where we are now. That is the truth of where we are now. And a lot of people are fighting it, and I'm sure a lot of people will continue to fight it. I mean, all I see on TikTok now, like the cat videos have gone way down. It's like everything's political, right? Everything right now is political. And so that's the culture that we're in at the moment. Yeah. Right, I don't know, right? I mean, there's a lot of, every day it's something. So it's going to be a ride, like of kind of just watching what happens. Just, I guess the important thing that I want you to take away, if you take one thing away, I want you to understand the difference between sex and gender, because that is a huge thing right now. And I think a lot of people don't understand that difference. So I think understanding that one is very biological and one is very social and identity based, and that there are things that are going to be imposed right now relating to biology and relating to choice. Yeah.
I'm gonna like word salad this, but like, I am really worried about like, when it comes to all this politics and how it affects people. I'm worried about like the trans suicide rate. And
Sure.
stuff, because regardless of, let's say, not as much damage happens, as we think it's going to, or a lot of damage does happen. Right now, that's still going to affect a lot of people, and just the mental toll that's going to take.
Sure. Oh, yeah. And I think it's important, I mean, ideally, we keep mental health resources strong through all of this so that people do have access to support if they need it. Because, yeah, I mean, whatever identity you have, if it's being marginalized, that's hard. Like whether it's your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your orientation, your ability level. If it's marginalized, it makes it harder for you, right? And so having access to therapy and support, is going to be important. Yeah.
That was just trying to think, is he, okay, that whole job thing, yeah, I'm gonna work all of this too. The whole like, employment thing that he took away with the protection is,
Like the harassment protection.
yeah, and like against the racial protection. Is it also for,
It's complicated. Politics are complicated. right?
It's stressing me out, I can't even find my words.
Sure.
Is it also taking away for disabilities?
I don't know. There's so many like little intricacies of everything. And I feel like everything is being put out there right now, and then we'll see what happens with it, right? It's tricky, right? And so if you're trying to figure it out, like, as I mentioned, as I read, that is the current legislation, but there's a lot of gray in there that's still going to need to be defined before we know what it actually means for people. What I'd like to leave you with this, so I have this is obviously like, there are an incredible range of movies on here, but some of these are much more authentic and some are more entertainment based, but I have like some movies up here that kind of deal with like gender variety. But I would like to play a clip for you just to kind of end this. As I said, most people, 90-something% of people are cisgender, right? They identify one way or the other. But really cool clip. Somebody shared this with me a few semesters back. One of my students as part of their homework assignment. Ruby Rose identifies as very like gender fluid or non-binary or gender queer. I've heard many different like labels from her. But a really cool clip of her transitioning from hyper to hyper masculine. And I think it just does a beautiful job of showing the fluidity of gender based on the choices that you make and the way that you present yourself. So I'd like to just kind of end this unit with that. So I'll play it for you. But all of that, so that's the same person, right? Who went from hyper feminine to hyper masculine in one like clip. A lot of those choices when it comes to gender are things that you can take off and put on like that. Like some of it is appearance based, right? Like changing the clothes, the makeup or lack of makeup and all of those things, the hair. And then some of it is your identity of what you identify internally and how you express yourself and so on. But I think such a cool clip of somebody who identifies as gender fluid, literally going from the extreme of one to the extreme of the other, right? And again, I don't think many people could do that and keep functioning, right? It's just such a huge transition. It's wild. Any like thoughts about that or anything else here? I guess I could go back here. Yeah.
So is she like, I mean, does she do that regularly?
I don't think so. Most of the time when I've seen her both ways. Yeah, like here's the movie that we watched. Oh, The Meg over the weekend, and she looked more like she does at the end there, kind of. But I've seen her very hyper feminine. I've seen her very hyper masculine, and a lot of in the middle, right?
First time I ever saw her was
Yeah. Right, just very like fluid, right? And like again, most people pick a lane and tend to kind of stay in it. Like for her, kind of being able to do both isn't as common either, and being comfortable doing either. And what's wild is think about the partners you have, whoever they are, right? Oftentimes gender is something that we're attracted to, right? Like I love that my partner is very feminine. If my partner tomorrow, like, and we've talked about this a million times, right? Like if my partner tomorrow was like, I'm gonna buzz my head and wear your clothes, I'd be like, do you have to, right? Like, why? Like, why? And the same, like, to be fair, like if I decided to grow my hair out and wear her clothes, we'd have the same issue, right? Like I'm attracted to the fact that she's feminine and that that's her gender identity. And she's attracted to the fact that I'm like more masculine and that's my gender. So not only do we have the element of identity, but then it also can influence your orientation and who you're attracted to. It's also complicated how it's all linked together. And so there are people who love that gender fluidity and find that attractive. And then there are people who like the more like you have a set preference. And so just like we get pan-gender and gender queer, we also get pansexual and asexual, and we'll have all those terms that we'll get to in a few weeks too. We'll go here and then, yeah.
I've seen a lot of like cisgender men say, oh, I have a preference on trans person. Would that fall? Like, does that actually stand, or is that just being
Their genitalia preferences.
Yeah.
As long as you're not like,
Yeah.
I hate trans women, then it's fine.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a preference as long as there's no like prejudice or discrimination that comes out of it, right? Like, so like I have a preference of like what I find attractive. I imagine all of you have like something that you would be drawn to. Maybe it's some of you, maybe it's much larger and others it's much more narrow. Depends, right? But as long as you don't have like a prejudice or discrimination toward people who don't meet that, I don't think there's anything wrong with a preference at all. It's just like a preference for anything. We all have preferences. But it's when you start treating other people in a different way because they don't meet your preference, you know, where it starts to maybe go beyond you. There was another, yeah.
So I'm not totally sure about this, but as far as if it's fact or not, but I think there's some sort of, just from the reading that I did in the past, I think there's like a chromosomal or DNA thing for a woman that is kind of maybe, I guess it wouldn't be androgynous, because I don't know if it's gender or if it's like at birth, but I'm so sorry. I'm like obviously like literally I can't talk when there's stuff.
It's also Monday morning. That doesn't help with
Okay,
it. But think about
my
it.
ex
And it's okay, yeah.
Okay, she had the biggest boobs like I've ever seen in my life, but she was also, very, kind of androgynous, but more, maybe even more active, more guyish. But she had like the biggest boobs. I think there's like a DNA thing that can affect that and the masculinity.
that can affect.
like, that for some reason gives them really big boobs.
Okay.
Also.
More of a correlation, but-
Yeah, no, but I think it's like a, sorry, I keep saying.
That'd be very easy if that was the one marker, right? Like if that was like your one genetic thing that you had, then it would make it, but it was probably correlational, like I would assume.
No, I think it's something that like actually, that actually makes that happen along with this other side. I don't know, sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm trying to follow
It's
the
just
thought. but-
interesting.
So there's a lot that's interesting about it,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure that her having a really large chest correlated to the other. Like, I mean, there are genetic things that might express themselves in certain ways that have correlations, but as is the famous psychology phrase, with everything, correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Just because two things are connected doesn't have to mean they cause each other, but that doesn't make it any less interesting to, it could be your future research study. You could go out and measure people's chest size and how it correlates to their gender identity. It could be an interesting stuff. In honor of your ex,
Yeah.
right? And you could open with that as you do the research. Yeah. The transvestite means you dress in the opposite's clothing. That would be a cross-dresser. So transvestite, like if I go back to, yes, so Rocky Horror, Chu Wong Fu, RuPaul, anyone who's like a drag king or a drag queen would be considered a cross-dresser or a transvestite. Now, when people are transvestites, it just means that they wear the opposite clothing, typically with the purpose of performance or for show or for a reason that doesn't have to do with identity. Versus transgender would be when it's your identity, and that's why you wear it. Transsexuals, when you've changed your sex anatomy to match what you do. So lots of terms all kind of capturing similar dimensions. But yeah, so the only one up here, like two up here, so like Boys Don't Cry and Trans America will probably be the only two up here that are more like authentic representations of trans identity. A lot of the other ones are like for show. So I put this one up here as a good example of something that doesn't have to do with identity. It's for like a specific purpose. So when you wear clothing of the opposite sex, which again is very up to interpretation of what that means, that would be more like transvestism or cross-dressing.
It's been a while since I've seen Hedwig, but what would you consider Hedwig to be? Because
Yeah,
it's more like a sexuality.
right. And it might be somewhere in the middle, right? You know, like, yeah, that's probably the trickiest example up here, I would say. Like, yeah, Hedwig and the Angry Inch, like interesting movie, a lot of interesting movies up here. And so that one might be somewhat identity mixed with performance, and they can mix. Of course they can mix like anything else. Okay, so from here to anatomy, now we get to go to anatomy, right? So before I put this up, I have an activity that we're gonna do. And so I want you to do 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, I want you to get into groups, let's say like 4 or 5 people. Okay, so go ahead and get into a group, turn your desk, you're gonna spend like 10 minutes with your group. So say like 4 to 5 people, find a group. And then I'll tell you what's happening next. Alright.
Well, I guess I have.
Alright, does everybody have a group?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what I'm gonna have you do in a moment. You're gonna send one person from your group up to grab 3 things from you. Okay? So I want you to you're gonna grab a marker, grab 2 of them, but if one of them's dead, you can just toss it. Grab a marker or 2. You're gonna grab 1 little piece of paper and then 1 big piece. Okay? Are you ready? Build the tree. So what I'm gonna have you, hold on 1 second. I love that you were ready. I love that you're ready. You were excited to try. Okay. So on this piece of paper, this little piece of paper, I have a list of anatomy structures for women. I want you as a group to draw and label these structures to the best of your knowledge right now. Please don't look it up. Don't look at the slides. If you have a book open, close it. So I will say, well, just so you don't have to yell, so if you don't know what it is, you can be creative and label whatever you want, or you can leave it off. I've seen some really funny versions of these things, so feel free to be creative if you want. A lot of people will draw 2 pictures because some of these are internal and some of these are external structures. So you can draw 1 picture or 2. Draw it nice and bold. You can do black permanent markers. You can do pencil first, but draw it bold. Label what you can, and then we're gonna we'll put them up. Okay. So when you're ready, come out, set it, grab one of each of those 3 things, and then go ahead and get started. Sorry. And grab a paper and-
Okay.
So do the and don't look it up. Don't look it up.
Yeah, that's totally good.
I'll take you. I think to have different ones.
I'm not good at acting, so. Oh, wait, I
I'll just look at this.
Why do you know this? It's very hard.
I mean, too big, that's okay.
That's like right after.
And then it gets down, and then I think it's either that or it's this way. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. He's not watching I know not to.
I'm trying to sort out.
Let's go for 5 more minutes, so 5 more minutes.
You're not in here. Now that right now. Oh my gosh, yeah. It's so. I really want to be here.
This is this person professionally. Yes.
No,
It's mid for. Okay. Now with the audience, so.
Yeah.
This guy.
It's a sun level. Yeah, we don't really know. We know one. I'm in like a big.
You're sure it's a pretty pass. There too many people think you're done for reaching the same pass. There you go.
They are kidding, guys. It's not, it's so, it's. They can't afford to speak. Like, vagina. There we go. She might be, yeah. Yeah. And then.
Are you done? Can I get, okay, I'll take it if you're done.
We even did it.
Wait, don't show it to people. Guys, no kidding.
Our vagina is actually delivery, though. It's made delivery.
Yeah, go ahead.
That you can have. It doesn't like when it gets offered by fun. No, that's so smart. We find out.
Lady of the draw.
Where the egg floats, and then it completely misses the hungry too, so I take it in bed anywhere. Outside the room.
Like if it's it's a good
I mean, it's all right, bro. It's crazy how all these processes work. So it's not 100%.
That's all smaller, that you wouldn't go to.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Okay.
I'm not happy. Last time.
We did it, but it's a little bit. They have to do it. There's like your wow. I'm like, their vagina looks better than our vagina. I'm very proud of
Thank you
this.
for the sexuality class.
That happened to me another lesson.
Oh, nice. Stop her legs spread.
Or you're a stable side. It's like that one,
If you ever forget where it is. Right there.
Yeah.
Someone take a picture after they're all out.
Oh, I like that.
And you say, oh, that's good. Are we might have to do one with the nails too, or?
Yeah, we should stop that.
We have like 5 parts.
This mail was the model man. This was. If you have markers, it's coming back.
It's really good. I mean, is that all vaginas? No.
Oh, yeah, one.
Okay.
This is like the most.
That's the vagina with a vowel. That's it here. Would you like to post this?
No, I'm good. All right. Okay, let's go. Okay. So, very nicely done, right? I have to tell you that one year I left these up all around the room and I got in so much trouble. And it kind of made me happy on like some small note. I got called in and my dean was like, "That's not okay." She was laughing, like she thought it was hilarious, but she's all like, "It's a little distracting for the math class that came out." It's like, but they could learn something else, like maybe translate into math things, whatever. So,
Just put it away and bring it back.
right, no, I just hang them up in my office. But, what gave you trouble? Did anyone have like a structure that you didn't know? The perineum or perineum, the mons veneris, right? So the mons veneris or mons pubis. I've had some really creative versions of that over time. Someone drew a spaceship and called it the USS Mons Veneris, which was memorable. Veneris Targaryen, we had that one once, like, I thought that was funny too. What was the other one? I wrote it down. Oh, Count Mons Veneris, it was a vampire, which was hilarious, yeah.
Because I know what a monster is every single one. It's also called.
Oh, but I was hoping some of you would be very creative. So that was my secret intention. But these look really good. Again, I'm not at all artistic. These are impressive. I really love the thigh tattoos. I think that'd be a good one to get, right? No, thank you. But not only would that hurt, but it'd be funny. I think. But anatomy is complicated, okay? And so what we'll focus on in this unit and with the male anatomy, most of us don't know all the technical names for everything. And most of the time that's okay. But it's important to know all the technical names and locations of things for things like going to the doctor, right? If something hurts or isn't functioning properly, you want to know what you're referring to. You don't want to have to be like, you know, that thing down there that like is bothering you, right? You want to know what the technical names for things are, what they do. That's what we'll focus on a little bit when we talk about anatomy. Smart to draw 2 pictures. A lot of you did a beautiful job of that. I'll leave them up for the rest of class at least. Yeah, I don't want to get in too much trouble, but I enjoy having them up. They're so colorful. Oh, I'm not doing that. Yeah, I have 3 children. I've learned better than to choose one. I know. I do enjoy the versions of hair that we have. Anyway, so we won't get too far into this. We only have about 11 minutes left. But what we'll look at external structures, internal structures. We'll talk about menstruation, menopause, some health concerns, and then the secondary sex characteristics like the breasts. Yeah, if you need to go back to your seats, that's fine. And then when we get to male anatomy, we'll do the same, internal, external. We'll talk about sperm production. Somebody said male anatomy is less complicated. Easier. You said 5 structures, right? There are. My apologies, right? So male anatomy is complicated too, especially with sperm production, which we'll talk about when we get there. So a memorable picture for you here. So when we talk about anatomy for women, right? Mons veneris up at the top or mons pubis, either way. So we have external anatomy and internal anatomy for women, okay? So these are external structures that we're looking at up here. So let's talk about them a little bit. So collectively, when we talk about external female anatomy, we're not talking about the vagina. Vagina is an internal structure, right? So it's something we'll get to in a later slide. External anatomy, collectively, we can call it the vulva. Okay, so when we're talking about all external anatomy, that's kind of our umbrella term. So we can put that here. So if we look at a few of these structures, let's put a few of them up here. So again, vulva would be all external anatomy, all of it together collectively under that umbrella. Every vulva is different, right? I've interviewed quite a few gynecologists. I watched an interesting excerpt from a documentary, and it was like 600 gynecologists being interviewed about what vulvas look like, right? And all of them said every single one is different, right? Whether it's changes in hair and how much hair people have, presence or absence of it, the size and shape of the lips of the vagina, the external, the labia minora or labia majora. So I did a quick Google search. This was so dangerous, even more dangerous for male anatomy, but I did it anyway. I got flagged, just getting in trouble left and right. I love it. So different appearances from woman to woman, right? So obviously different preferences on hair, different size and shape of the different like lips, the majora and minora. So an incredible amount of variety, and no two look the same. We'll move back from that. Great. So if we look at some of these structures, so I'm going to write the mons veneris up here, mons veneris, or mons pubis, as it's sometimes called. So the mons veneris is that kind of fatty, padded area of tissue that sits on top of the pubic bone, hence the pubis, right? So mons veneris, mons pubis, Latin after the Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty. That's where the term comes from. It protects the pubic bone, protect and cushion, specifically during intercourse, right? So interestingly, if you look at the design of our anatomy and our processes that we go through each month are very much designed for reproduction, right? So for the purposes of having children. Now, obviously, a lot of people have sex or like intimate interactions that have nothing to do with wanting children, but that's how our bodies are designed. So this area, which can be covered with hair or not, right after like puberty, has the protection and cushioning intention during intercourse, right? Because it's like a fatty mound of tissue. We have the labia. So we have the labia majora and the labia minora. These are the lips that we often refer to them as the lips. The majora are the outer lips. And they have a similar intention or function, right, of protecting and cushioning, kind of insulating everything, if you will, kind of containing or insulating. But the labia minora, the inner lips, which are much smaller and thinner, they have quite a few like sweat and oil glands. And these play a really big role in lubrication when somebody is aroused. When they're aroused, the oil and sweat glands within the labia minora, right, become engorged, allowing someone to like have that lubrication or be wet right when they're aroused, right? So that's a big function. Of those have a lot of nerve endings as well, very sensitive. Right, so it can be a very sensitive part of female anatomy. We have the clitoris. The Greek statue, right? I always love the documentaries where nobody knew about the clitoris. It was the statue in Greece that we visited, right? It has one function, pleasure. It is a dense group of like nerve endings that really has no function other than feeling good to be stimulated and pleasure. The equivalent in men would be like the head of the penis or the glands, which we'll talk about when we get to male anatomy. But it is typically covered by like a foreskin or a prepuce. Just like you would see with men. We remove the foreskin in men often through circumcision, but it's under what we would call like a clitoral hood. Some people really enjoy stimulation of this. Other people find it to be too much, but it only has the function of pleasure. That's like the one function of that part of anatomy. We have the urethra, which is where urine passes. So we have the vaginal opening and we have a urethral opening. They're different. Okay, so the vaginal opening would be where like childbirth, like where a baby would pass through the vaginal canal, where intercourse takes place, right? If you're inserting like a penis or other object, right? That's where that would be. The urethra is where urine passes out from the bladder. Yeah. Oh yeah, I didn't put it on there. I just did the vaginal. I didn't want to add too many things for you to draw. So I picked and chose which one. Look at some of you drew it anyway. I love that. And some of you even drew other pieces of anatomy. I love for reference, right? Okay. A few other things. The hymen. Anyone know what's the slang term for hymen? Anyone know? Common term that we use for slang? Yes, your cherry, right? So if you've ever heard someone saying like you popped their cherry, hymen is a very thin piece of tissue that covers the vaginal opening, right? And when people have intercourse for the first time, sometimes it ruptures, and that's why there's a little bit of bleeding. That can sometimes happen on someone's first time having sex. Can also be ruptured by like a tampon or a finger, right? Or something like earlier. But if you remember the documentary we watched about Kinsey, they said his wife had a restricted hymen. And so if somebody has like a very like restricted hymen, it could make intercourse very difficult or painful for them. She required surgery. But this is like a tiny little like covering. So it covers the vaginal opening. And it's oftentimes ruptured when somebody has intercourse for the first time. Yeah. 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 And interestingly, historically, the hymen had a lot of like historical relevance. If you've ever like watched any like shows that portray like medieval times or Renaissance times or whatever earlier, if they were checking to see if a woman was virtuous or a virgin, what they would do is have like a midwife come in and see if their hymen was still intact. If their hymen had been ruptured, it was assumed that they had had sex, and then that like plummeted their value for getting married, right? They were no longer a virgin or virtuous. Totally flawed. This can be ruptured by a lot of different things, as we just talked about. But historically, that's what we looked at to see if somebody was still a virgin. Yeah.
Tissue was thicker.
Yeah, like thicker and like blocking, almost like it had fused across her vaginal opening. And so penetration would be very difficult to do until surgically. Not very common, but it happened for Kinsey's wife. There was another, is there another hand over here? Somewhere? Yeah, sorry.
I raised beforehand, but there are medications people can take when they're young that pediatricians can catch. That can help prevent that when someone's older.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Much more treatment for it now than there was back then. Much more awareness too. Yeah. Okay, so one last structure up here, the perineum or the perineum. And then we'll stop for today. I always spell this wrong. I-N-E-U-M, perineum. This is just a smooth stretch of skin between the end of the vulva and the anal opening. Right, men have this stretch of skin as well. So I'll just say it's a smooth skin. Can be very sensitive. If you've ever heard of somebody having an episiotomy, not to make you think about this, but sometimes women, when they give birth, will tear. Okay, like if a baby is really large, right? I'm sorry. You're like, I'll draw whatever you want, just don't talk about that, right? But if a baby is really large, their head's really big, this smooth stretch of skin can sometimes tear. Much less common now because we're more aware of it. You can do stretches and things to help like massage the area to make that less likely to happen. But men also possess it. It's a very smooth, sensitive stretch of skin between the opening and the anal. Yep. So I'll stop here for today. And then what we'll do on Wednesdays, we'll talk about internal anatomy, a lot about menstruation. If you want to take pictures with your thing, I'll leave them up here for a few minutes. If I don't have your markers, you can start bringing them up. Otherwise, I'll see you all on
Girl. Oh, I love it. But he's making big bars. I like to tight. I'm saying before, I feel like the monkey.